In 1992, a young mother was gunned down in front of her children. Police searched for answers but found nothing. Then family members offered a startling clue. It would take local and federal agents to untangle an intricate web of money, drugs, and murder to capture the architects of a heartbreaking crime.
Two young boys were the only witnesses to their mother's murder. The horrible crime appeared unmotivated, senseless, and random. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. The victim, the wife of a prominent Atlanta attorney, was also a woman burdened with a secret. The FBI believed that secret led to her death. They hoped its discovery would also lead to her killer.
November 29th, 1992, Atlanta, Georgia. Travelers returned home at the end of the Thanksgiving holiday.
It's been a long trip, and I'm ready to get home. What about you?
39-year-old Sarah Tokars and her two children had spent the long weekend with her parents in Florida. Her husband, a well-known lawyer and judge, was away on business. After a 9-hour drive, they arrived safely in their suburban Atlanta neighborhood of Marietta. The house was dark as they pulled into the driveway. But it was not empty. Sarah did not see a man waiting in the shadows of the garage. He brandished a weapon. The gunman forced Sarah back into the SUV. The terrified woman had a 6-year-old at her side and a 4-year-old still asleep in the car. She had no choice. The man put his gun to Sarah's head and told her to drive towards the city.
Make this left now, this left.
She followed instructions. As they reached an empty development, he told her to turn off. She refused. She pleaded with him to let her children go. He answered with a single gunshot to her head. As the gunman grabbed her purse and fled, the vehicle kept rolling. The children still inside. When it came to a stop, Sarah's 6-year-old son had to reach across his mother's body to turn off the ignition. He unbuckled his groggy 4-year-old brother from his car seat, then ran to the nearest house. There, a neighbor called 911. Officers responded to the report of a possible homicide in the vicinity of Powers Road. Cobb County Police were dispatched immediately. Homicide detectives arrived as officers fanned out to search for the gunman. Police briefed them on the spot. The two young boys who witnessed the shooting identified the victim as their mother, Sarah Tokars. Their father, Fred Tokars, was out of town. Police were already trying to contact him. Forensic technicians examined the vehicle where it had stopped. There might be trace evidence outside as well as inside the car. An analysis confirmed what the boys had told police. The gunman was sitting directly behind Sarah Tokars when he pulled the trigger. Blood spatter patterns suggested he had used a shotgun. Detectives knew it would be difficult to get detailed information from children so young, especially after such a traumatic experience. The oldest one, 6 years old, would try his best. He said the killer was a black male, wearing jeans, a sweatshirt, and a cap. He could not be more specific. The boy didn't know which way the killer had run after he grabbed his mother's purse. But he said the weapon looked like a pirate's gun that you would see on TV.
And we'll get in touch with them.
Detectives were not sure what he meant. Maybe the autopsy would tell them more. Detectives tracked down relatives living in the area to take custody of the boys until their father could be located. Police learned the family's address by running the plates on the vehicle. They continued the investigation at the Tokars' home where the abduction had occurred. In the living room, they found a security dowel lying next to a sliding glass door. The killer had likely entered the house here. The home security system had not been activated.
Right here, let's get some photographs.
No alarm sounded as the intruder entered.
And then after that, I want you to go ahead and process it.
Perhaps a burglar had taken advantage of the lax security, and Sarah surprised him when she returned home. Whoever the burglar was, he hadn't left any trace evidence at the Tokars' home. There was little to go on, according to Cobb County Chief Detective Arthur Allred.
At this point, we just really didn't know what happened. This was in a upper middle class neighborhood. This was a mother with her 2 children, and this type of crime was just didn't occur in this area at all. The most serious crime we had probably vandalism. So initially, we were really baffled as to what had happened and why.
Sarah's eldest son worked with a police sketch artist and described the man in the dark who had killed his mother. The drawing of a thin black man wearing a knit hat was released to the public. But the 6-year-old's description was too vague to elicit any viable leads. The victim's husband, Fred Tokars, was contacted at his hotel in Montgomery, Alabama. He returned to Atlanta immediately. As a criminal defense attorney, Tokars was aware he would be considered an early suspect in his wife's murder. He had his own attorney present when he spoke to authorities. They quickly established his alibi so police could pursue more promising leads. Detectives confirmed that at the time of the murder, Fred Tokars was in Alabama. He had been visiting a client incarcerated in the Montgomery jail. The grieving husband assured police that he and Sarah had a strong marriage.
I don't answer any questions. I just want to basically, see the case.
He would do anything he could to help find her killer.
Due to the nature of what's going on, we have a job to do.
All right, guys.
Tokars agreed to walk detectives through the house.
Anything's been messed up here. Yeah, your alarm.
As far as he knew, the doors were locked and the security rod was in place when he left for Montgomery.
You said it before you left, right? My wife usually does that.
He explained that they had intentionally left the alarm off because a plumber was scheduled to fix the hot water heater over the weekend.
Look out for their safety.
We can
Tokars led detectives to the basement where he kept his home office.
take a moment here. I want you to really look around.
He said he usually had about $1,500 locked in the safe.
That was usually kept.
Now it was open and empty.
I do keep some cash in there.
Its combination was hidden in a nearby file.
$2,000 for the trip.
Only he and his wife knew it was there. Perhaps Sarah had taken the money on her trip to Florida. It was also possible that the burglar had found the combination and taken the cash.
Looks like everything's okay.
Ultimately, Tokars couldn't specify how much money, if any, was missing.
All right.
To police, nothing else in the house seemed disturbed, and no clues pointed to the killer's identity.
A lot of people were frightened. A lot of people just couldn't believe that this would happen to a mother in front of her children, and especially in the neighborhood where it occurred. So there was a lot of pressure on the department to find who had killed her.
Police hoped the coroner's report would give them more. Lab examiners confirmed that Sarah Tokars had been killed with a .410 shotgun. To a child, if that type of weapon had been sawed off, it might look like a 17th century flintlock pistol used by pirates on TV. Only the plastic wadding and buckshot were recovered from the SUV.
It might be a 410 or maybe a 20 gauge.
Because no shell casing had been ejected, they would not be able to match anything to a specific weapon if one were later found.
Maybe 410. I'll get to the ballistics for you.
The examiner discovered no foreign hairs, fibers, or fingerprints on the body or clothing.
That fell out of the body bag.
The anonymous killer had left nothing that could lead investigators to his
Very
identity.
interesting to show you.
Former Assistant United States Attorney Buddy Parker, like many members of the Atlanta community, was stunned by the news of the murder.
We had a discussion that morning about the notoriety of the homicide, of it being the wife of Fred Tokars, who was known within the legal community, having been a former assistant district attorney for Fulton County. I was familiar with Fred Tokars in his role as a criminal defense lawyer in a matter that was then pending in our office, a matter regarding the investigation of a particular drug dealer.
Fred Tokars' lucrative criminal defense practice brought him into contact with many men accused of federal drug charges. Rarely does such a murder have a simple motive. Solving the case would not be easy. The following day, two women came to the Cobb County Police Station. Sarah Tokars' sister and her cousin had a file they needed to show detectives. Sarah had entrusted her sister with the file 3 years earlier.
You know what this is?
This is some of her husband's friends.
At the time, Sarah made her promise to take it to police if anything ever happened to her.
Something would happen, like divorce, overseas bank accounts.
It contained what appeared to be lists of Fred Tokars' bank accounts and their balances.
I told her 3 years ago.
Well, how long have you known?
The women suggested that the papers might be related to Sarah's attempt to divorce Fred.
His family, my family have been friends. I can't put up with it anymore.
Her sister's marriage was not as strong as Fred had led police to believe.
Well, that might be so, but I know what you've been doing.
Sarah wanted a divorce, but whenever she broached the subject, he threatened to use his legal connections to get sole custody of their children.
All right, guys. Let me tell you something.
Sarah was
You have a
trapped.
divorce, but you'll never see the
If
kids
she ever
again.
hoped to divorce
All right,
Fred
I
and
know
keep
all
her
these
children,
judges, all
she
these
needed
attorneys
leverage.
Well, in case there was a divorce.
After the incident, Sarah had secretly copied some of Fred's files and gave them to her sister for safekeeping.
Quite a long time.
She suspected they outlined illegal activities he might be involved in.
Liar. Wouldn't treat my sister.
If that were so, they could be her only leverage against him in court.
She went to his office.
Some of the information you did.
Investigators reviewed the files carefully.
This fashion.
Perhaps they would help police determine whether Sarah Tokars' death was a botched robbery or a carefully planned conspiracy. Cobb County detectives called the FBI office in Atlanta for help. They hoped that Special Agent Michael Twible could determine if Fred Tokars' bank statements were somehow linked to the murder.
We were contacted by the Cobb County authorities concerning the documents they had discovered, which were brought to them by Sarah Tokars' sister and cousin, which revealed that Mr. Tokars, her husband, had been involved in setting up offshore bank accounts and offshore corporations.
It would take time for Agent Twible and his team to unravel the names and finances on those documents to see if they had something or nothing to do with the death of Sarah Tokars. On December 3rd, 1997, 4 days after the shooting, Sarah Tokars was laid to rest. Her 2 children were left motherless. Investigators still had no leads that pointed to the identity of her killer. Whoever had killed the young mother was still out on the streets. Just after Thanksgiving in 1997, the FBI and local investigators continued their search for the lone gunman who shot and killed Sarah Tokars, the wife of a prominent Atlanta attorney, in front of her 2 young children. Sarah's 6-year-old child had given a vague description of the suspect to police in Cobb County, Georgia, but they still had no solid leads. Copies of her husband's bank statements were sent to the FBI field office in Atlanta for closer scrutiny. Special Agent Michael Twible hoped to provide insight as to whether the documents might somehow be connected to Sarah Tokars' murder.
Once we reviewed these documents, it revealed that Mr. Tokars had set up offshore banks and corporations not only in the Turk and Caicos, but in Montserrat and in the Bahamas. These documents also showed that he had set up numerous corporations and nominees' names in the Atlanta, Georgia area.
Nominees are people who in name only head dummy corporations for purposes of money laundering. Although Fred Tokars had never been accused of money laundering himself, he was an expert on the subject. Buddy Parker, a former assistant U.S. attorney, was aware that Tokars was not only a well-known lawyer, he was also a certified public accountant.
Fred Tokars was known within the Atlanta legal community as a person who held himself out to be an expert in money laundering, and in fact conducted lectures for law enforcement authorities at the state level on money laundering.
Stan. Hey,
Investigating the finances of a man like Fred Tokars would be a delicate business.
really needs to be out on the street.
He was well liked and well connected among Atlanta's power elite.
He was well known in Cobb County. He was also well known in political circles, in as much as he had been appointed as an assistant municipal court judge, and he had been an assistant solicitor for Fulton County. He had a lot of friends in high political places and helped on numerous campaigns of state and local officials.
I'm wondering if you have any...
Investigators again met with Tokars and his attorney. They told him they believed his business dealings could be connected to his wife's killing and asked him about his clients.
Has your wife mentioned anything to you about anyone that she...
Fred Tokars admitted several were violent drug dealers who operated in dangerous circles. One in particular was reputed to have been a major cocaine supplier in the Atlanta area. The dealer had returned home to Detroit after another one of Tokars' clients had allegedly forced him out of the South. Not Not long after, he was gunned down in front of his mother's home. The murder weapon, a handgun found later in a nearby alley, had been traced back to a gun shop north of Atlanta. Tokars suggested that the dealer's remaining crew, or even those who murdered him, could have had Sarah killed to send a message to the lawyer.
We can arrange something and get it over to you.
Detectives secured a warrant to search the attorney's office to see if they could find any link to the killer in his papers. That night, local investigators and IRS agents conducted a thorough search of the office. They confiscated files, date books, and business calendars dating back several years, but found no direct clues to the murder. In the margins of Tokars' date books, agents did find notations of offshore accounts. The total deposited in these accounts far exceeded the amount Tokars claimed on his taxes each year. It looked as if Fred Tokars had used his expertise in money laundering to his own financial advantage. Local and federal officials met with representatives of the Atlanta United States Attorney's Office. They suspected Fred Tokars' illegal activities went far beyond money laundering.
Money laundering was already on our radar screen, if you will. Secondly, now we have evidence coming out of the Tokars' home of offshore bank accounts. With those two clear facts, we felt that there was a firm basis to open an investigation formally on Fred Tokars.
Parker learned that in August of 1992, the DEA had arrested one of Tokars' clients in a sting operation. His name was Anthony Brown. Brown had a reputation as a cocaine dealer in Atlanta. The day before, agents had intercepted one of his couriers in Texas and seized more than 100 kilos of cocaine. Inside the trunk of Brown's car, agents found $50,000 in cash. They also found documents revealing Fred Tokars was more than Brown's defense attorney. He had incorporated an Atlanta nightclub for the drug dealer.
It was believed by law enforcement that the nightclub was a front to help launder the drug proceeds of the drug trafficking organization that Brown was a member of.
DEA agent Jeff Dahlman had participated in the sting operation to arrest Brown. Parker hoped Dahlman's drug trafficking case would help with the murder investigation.
What had happened as a result of the homicide of Mrs. Tokars was that the light got turned on Fred Tokars' past of what he had been doing for the past several years. And what was illuminated was that he'd been involved with several drug traffickers in the Atlanta area.
How you doing?
Investigators wondered how deep that involvement went.
You have a few minutes?
Police re-interviewed Tokars' neighbors to see if they had missed anything.
I was wondering if on Sunday evening...
One close friend confirmed that Sarah wanted to divorce her husband, but she was afraid of him. Not long before she was murdered, Sarah confided that she had found some of her husband's documents that seemed suspicious. According to the neighbor, Sarah said these weren't simply lists of offshore accounts. They were stronger proof of criminal activities.
Hey, listen, I need to give you a call back. Yeah, just a few minutes.
About a week and a half before Sarah Tokars' murder, Sarah Tokars explained to her that she now had the goods on Fred, that she had found documents or records that indicated he had engaged in or was engaging in tax evasion, and that she was going to go to the authorities with this information and she could then get a divorce.
If Sarah had confronted her husband with the evidence, it might have motivated him to harm her.
Any reason to believe Tokars?
Investigators additionally found the name of a Tokars private investigator.
Appreciate it. Work with you.
The PI admitted to agents that Tokars had hired him to approach drug dealers about laundering their profits. He was listed as one of the owners, along with Fred Tokars, of another Atlanta nightclub, according to Special Agent Michael Twyble.
We determined that he was an owner of a company, but through our further investigation, we realized that he was a nominee. And when I say the word nominee, I mean the fact that he was delegated to the person being legally responsible as being an owner of the club, but in actuality, he was not.
Fred Tokars had constructed the entire scheme. According to the Private Eye, Tokars courted reputed drug dealers like Anthony Brown, men who had a lot of cash, but no place to invest it without raising suspicions of the IRS. Tokars, a money laundering expert, proposed depositing their drug profits in offshore accounts and in businesses like clubs that operated primarily on a cash basis. The money could then be filtered through legitimate financial institutions.
And the way you would launder the money is, even though it's still in cash, you would pay entertainers on paper $15,000, when in actuality you paid them $5,000 cash.
Tokars would receive thousands for each transaction.
He was actively involved, knowing that these people were drug traffickers and what they were doing with their money. The object was to open corporations, mainly nightclubs, cash businesses where they could easily hide their assets, where they could easily run their drug proceeds through them.
Authorities believe the connection between Fred Tokars and drug traffickers had somehow led to his wife's murder. But the details were elusive.
Get back in that car now!
Weeks after the murder of Sarah Tokars, a man capable of murdering an innocent mother in front of her children remained at large.
Got a shotgun blast to the back of the...
By December 1992, several weeks after Sarah Tokars was killed, federal and state authorities had still not found the lone gunman and still had no clues to his identity.
So it's a lot of...
Shortly before she was brutally murdered, Sarah believed she had discovered papers in her husband's law office that documented his illegal activities. Former U.S. prosecutor Buddy Parker believed that Sarah had likely threatened to expose Fred Tokars with those documents unless he agreed to a divorce.
That began to give us a feeling that Sarah Tokars was murdered to keep her mouth shut about her knowledge or her belief about her husband's role and involvement in laundering drug money for drug traffickers.
Fred Tokars not only represented violent drug dealers, he had gone into business with them. Investigators now had evidence Tokars' clients were laundering money through several nightclubs. If his wife had threatened to expose him, Tokars, as well as his clients, had a lot to lose. The FBI took a hard look at the nightclubs the attorney had incorporated. Special Agent Michael Twyble had to wade through piles of state records, searching for a name that could link Tokars directly to the murder.
We started reviewing company and corporation records and liquor license and business license that Mr. Tokars had incorporated. We started looking at these different clubs to see actually who owned them.
Major drug suppliers like Al Brown contributed the funds. A middleman purchased the clubs. And Tokars set up the entire deal, as DEA agent Jeff Dahlman discovered.
They didn't really trust Mr. Tokars to launder money in offshore bank accounts. It was too elaborate. They wanted their money where they could touch it, where they could feel it, where they could use it every day, where they could buy cars with it. And so the laundering, in essence, in this investigation, turned towards the laundering of money through nightclubs, through incorporation of the nightclubs.
FBI agents interviewed employees of the nightclubs. Over time, they were able to piece together the structure of the business, its owners, and its profits. To Attorney Parker, it was like assembling a complex puzzle.
Never heard anything about money laundering.
The picture of how the nightclub money laundering was structured was really developed through insiders, through inside drug traffickers who ultimately decided to cut plea agreements with us and to cooperate and provide evidence.
But nothing from the nightclubs pointed to Sarah Tokars' killer. After months of frustration, Cobb County Police finally got a break. A detective working on the case got a tip from his brother, a deputy in nearby Fulton County. The deputy remembered seeing Fred Tokars' name in the file for a businessman who had an outstanding arrest warrant. The businessman's name was Eddie Lawrence, wanted for writing bad checks on one of Tokars' accounts. Of all Tokars' business associates and clients, Eddie Lawrence was a name he had never mentioned to police. Authorities quickly learned that Eddie Lawrence and Fred Tokars were involved in several businesses together. These included construction, renovation, and mortgage companies. Tokars had also defended Lawrence in several minor brushes with the law. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead they had left.
Eddie Lawrence had, through Fred Tokars, been granted access to some of the most prominent individuals within the city. Fred would take Eddie to some of the big political fundraising functions, and all of a sudden Eddie was, like I said, he's very presentable. He could certainly mingle and not be embarrassed at cocktail functions and things, and engage in conversations, and so he was living this wonderful life, and the way he got there was through Fred Tokars.
A few days later, the young businessman agreed to questioning after police discovered records of calls between he and Tokars on the day of the murder. Eddie Lawrence said he had been in business with Fred Tokars for almost a year. He claimed the phone calls were all job-related. He knew nothing about Sarah Tokars' murder. The detectives had Lawrence arrested on the bad check charge and then released him on bond. They wanted to see which one of Tokars' associates got nervous when they heard Lawrence was being investigated.
This is a shock to me when I heard about her death.
The plan worked. The confidential informant contacted police. The word on the street was that Eddie Lawrence had been looking for a hitman prior to Sarah Tokars' murder. He had pressured one of his employees to help him find someone to kill a woman who he claimed stood in the way of a lot of money. The employee gave Lawrence a name, Curtis Rower. Rower was a drug addict with a long rap sheet including armed robbery. He needed money. Maybe he'd be interested. Although the informant didn't mention Fred Tokars by name, investigators finally had a potential link between the victim's husband, Eddie Lawrence, and a hitman. Detectives interviewed Eddie Lawrence.
No, I deny it.
We have information.
They questioned him about his relationship with Tokars.
That says recently you've been trying to get him gun.
Why would I have somebody?
He claimed no involvement in the murder.
When I had nobody around.
Police felt he was
Not
lying.
making any progress here. I have a warrant. Your name.
On December 16th, 1992, police detained Lawrence and revoked his bail because of the flight risk. They wanted him in custody when they went after Curtis Rower. Detectives immediately secured search and arrest warrants for a house in College Park where Rower was staying. They proceeded with caution. If Rower was capable of killing an innocent woman in cold blood, there was no telling what he might do when cornered. On December 22, 1992, 3 weeks after a mother of two was murdered, Cobb County Police circled a home in College Park to arrest suspected hitman Curtis Rower. The woman who answered the door said she wasn't sure if Rower was home. An initial sweep of the house produced nothing. Still, they kept up their guard. One officer thought he heard movement in a bedroom.
Curtis, you're in the bed. You see your hands.
It was Curtis Rower.
Hands where I can see them. Stay on the ground. Stay facing.
He was unarmed.
One out further. Lay down, all the way down. Spread your hands out. Keep them spread.
Rower was booked and charged with murder.
Give me your left hand.
He claimed that Eddie Lawrence, Fred Tokars' business partner, had offered him $5,000 to kill Sarah Tokars, but Rower was too scared to go through with it. He said Lawrence was the one who had caused Sarah's death. Rower admitted that he had carjacked the family. But when Sarah Tokars stopped, he said that he couldn't pull the trigger. At that moment, Eddie Lawrence ran up to the car, screaming for Rower to shoot. Lawrence grabbed the shotgun and it went off, killing Sarah Tokars. Both men then fled in Lawrence's car. Though police believed Rower was downplaying his role, Sarah's 6-year-old son was the only other witness they had to refute his claim. He remembered only one shooter. The boy would be forced to identify the man who terrorized his family from a lineup unless Eddie Lawrence corroborated Rower's story. Authorities charged Eddie Lawrence with conspiracy to commit murder, but Lawrence refused to confirm or deny Rower's statement.
Hello?
Cobb County Police notified Fred Tokars that Eddie Lawrence and Curtis Rower had been formally charged with his wife's murder. He received the news at Sarah's parents' house in Florida, where he was vacationing with his sons for the holidays.
Who was on the phone? It's the police. They've arrested someone for the murder. Thank God for that.
His relatives later said that while the rest of the family expressed relief, Fred Tokars did not. He seemed despondent. The arrests of Lawrence and Rower had made national headlines. Tokars was caught in that same spotlight and refused to give any statements to the press. Because the suspected hitman's story conflicted with Tokars' son's version, the 6-year-old was asked to view a suspect lineup. Police explained that though he would be able to see 5 men staring at him, they would not be able to see him. The one-way mirror would prevent that. When the child said he was ready, investigators called for the men. All of them resembled the boy's description of his mother's killer.
Okay, Michael. One of these gentlemen may be the person.
Detectives reassured him that he could take as much time as he needed.
You should take your time. You should look at me closely. You should tell me if you
But it was no use. The child was either too young or too frightened to remember the killer's face. When relatives tried to reach Fred Tokars in Florida to inform him, he was nowhere to be found.
Fred left the company of his in-laws and returned to his hotel room where no one heard from him. And the following morning, they tried to raise him on the telephone. They tried to find him, and there were no responses.
Concerned, Sarah's father rushed to the hotel where Tokars was staying.
Fred! Fred! Fred!
Fred Tokars had swallowed a handful of sleeping pills and washed it down with beer. The manager of the hotel quickly called an ambulance.
He had apparently attempted to take his life after hearing that Eddie Lawrence, this business partner of his, had been arrested for the murder of his wife.
Sarah's father found a note written in Fred Tokars' handwriting on the table beside the bed. In the locked hotel room, Fred Tokars wrote a long, rambling note apologizing for the pain and suffering his lifestyle had inflicted upon his family. He wrote that Sarah was a great woman. Then, on the day before Christmas Eve, Fred Tokars swallowed a handful of sleeping pills, enough to kill him. Fred Tokars lay on the bed, barely breathing. If he died, the truth about his wife's murder might die with him.
Come on, Fred.
Yes. Yes, there's been emergency.
In late December of 1992, Fred Tokars, the once prominent Atlanta attorney now suspected in his wife's murder, lay motionless in a Florida hotel room from an overdose of sleeping pills. He was rushed to a nearby hospital where they were able to revive him.
Thank you for coming down today.
After his release, he held a press conference.
A tough time for myself and also for my children.
He told the public that he was very depressed and that the media was not making it easy.
We did this terrible crime.
Tokars had gone to the extent of establishing residency in Florida to avoid the attention.
The whole way through this, so.
But he believed that justice would soon be served.
Mr. Tokars, may we have your comment on the arrest of Eddie Lawrence?
The FBI believed justice would soon be served as well. Convinced that Fred Tokars had used his business associate Eddie Lawrence to hire a hitman to kill Fred's wife, Sarah, the team of federal and local investigators would use federal racketeering statutes known as RICO to prosecute Tokars. Building a RICO case to prove Sarah Tokars had been killed to protect her husband's illegal activities meant outlining those activities in detail.
The RICO statute. It attacks basically this conspiracy of individuals who are out committing all types of different crimes, not necessarily together, but they're all for the benefit of this criminal group to exist, to continue to exist, and to make money.
Looks like things are coming together a little bit. I appreciate all you.
A federal grand jury named Tokars as an unindicted co-conspirator in the homicide.
Yeah, we've come up with some.
Though Tokars' partner, Eddie Lawrence, had remained silent after 7 months in prison, investigators hoped the public indictment might encourage Lawrence to testify against Tokars. Not long after, the Atlanta U.S. Attorney's Office received a phone call that Eddie Lawrence was ready to cooperate in exchange for sentencing consideration.
We've got some work to do. Let's go.
For Lawrence's long-awaited statement, investigators secured a remote location in Georgia that would be monitored by chopper surveillance. DEA agent Jeff Dahlman was part of the team that needed to make sure nothing went wrong.
We were there before Mr. Lawrence was brought in. His location had been kept a secret from everybody involved. The only people that knew of where Mr. Lawrence was actually being held at that time were the Cobb County Police Department. Mr. Lawrence at that time was a key witness in this investigation, and his safety was paramount to everyone.
Inside a fortified house, Eddie Lawrence told investigators that he and Tokars were not just partners in the construction business. They were also involved in laundering drug money.
$900,000.
Couple of drinks.
Lawrence told FBI Special Agent Michael Twyble the details of the scheme.
Mr. Tokars wanted him to try to solicit drug clients in the various nightclubs and bring them to him so he could launder their money. And in turn also set up Eddie Lawrence into several businesses.
Yeah, we can get this one just a little bit later. We may
Lawrence owed his success to Tokars. He also owed the attorney $70,000 in business debts.
Fred Tokars approached Eddie Lawrence indicating that, that Sarah now was going to try to divorce him and take everything he had, and he wasn't going to let that happen, and he couldn't afford to allow her to do that to him, and he wanted her killed.
Lawrence refused initially. Although he had been involved in drug dealing, he had never been involved in murder.
Mr. Lawrence said, well, just let her have the house and the kids and the cars. And Mr. Tokars said, I'd worked so hard, I'm not going to let her have it.
Lawrence said that Tokars planned the murder for several months. His first idea was to have Sarah shot in his office, but decided the couple's home was a better location. Tokars was to pay Lawrence $25,000 for the hit.
Mr. Lawrence advised that Mr. Tokars wanted to be out of town and that for Mr. Lawrence to commit the murder as a burglary, basically in front of his children, which is very unusual. He told Mr. Lawrence that the kids would get over it, that they're young, and it wouldn't bother them saying that their mother was murdered.
I found that
Lawrence admitted he didn't have the nerve to kill an innocent woman, so he hired Curtis Rower. After Rower shot Sarah Tokars, Lawrence drove him away from the scene. Since he cooperated, Lawrence earned 12.5 years for his part in setting up the murder. The hitman he hired, Curtis Rower, was sentenced to life without parole. For the time being, Tokars was still a free man.
Mr. Tokars had custody of his 2 children. Our concern during this time and the rest of Mr. Tokars was that there could be some harm done to the children. And Mr. Tokars was aware that he'd been watched. The media was still down in Florida at the time. He knew that people were watching him daily, and we had to develop a plan to get Mr. Tokars out of the house where there'd be no harm done to the children or to himself, and tried to effect the arrest.
The agents knew Tokars hated the press. They posed as reporters, lurking around the condo, hoping to elicit a response from the wanted man.
And the game plan at that time was to have Mr. Tokars come out and check us out, which he had done previously to other people that had been parked in the area. The plan worked well. He came downstairs. He called the police.
Local officers arrived, aware of the ruse. Fred Tokars emerged from his condo to file a complaint.
What we need you to do, sir, is go ahead and put your hand on your phone. You're under arrest.
Instead, he was arrested.
Spread your legs for me.
Fred Tokars pleaded not guilty to the charges against him.
Go ahead and put your hand on. She told Karen.
But separate state and federal juries found him guilty of racketeering, money laundering, murder for hire, and murder. He was sentenced to 4 life terms with no chance of parole. For elevating his greed beyond the life of his wife and children, he will never be free again. Blazing fires, raging adrenaline, and total anarchy. all within the walls of a federal prison. FBI tactical teams and negotiators work around the clock, trying to avoid a small-scale war and keep nearly 100 hostages alive.
In the 1980s, the federal penitentiary in Atlanta housed some of the country's most notorious prisoners. 1,800 Cubans fleeing Castro's regime. 400 were hardened criminals. 200 were insane. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. Castro called them undesirables. The U.S. government called them detainees. In 1987, they staged a bloody revolt. Now the FBI and special operations teams must infiltrate a burning prison to stop the violence before it rages out of control.
Cuba, 1980. A plummeting economy and political unrest prompt Fidel Castro to allow Cuban citizens to leave the country. For the first time in history, the notorious dictator permits American boats to enter Cuba's Mariel Harbor. In a 5-month period, over 120,000 undocumented refugees flee the country, heading for Florida. 2,700 are considered criminals or mentally ill under U.S. law. The Attorney General instructs the Bureau of Prisons to find space for them in America's already overcrowded prison system. 1,000 Cuban refugees are sent to the Federal Detention Center in Oakdale, Louisiana. Nearly 1,400 are transported to the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. For 7 years, the U.S. and Cuban governments negotiate to send the criminals and mentally ill refugees back to Cuba. On November 20th, 1987, the State Department strikes a treaty with Cuba. Over 2,700 Cuban detainees will be sent back. Within 24 hours, Cuban detainees in both prisons get news of the decision. In Oakdale, Louisiana, 1,000 of them riot, taking 28 prison guards hostage. But at the Atlanta Penitentiary, all is quiet. Warden Joe Petrovsky.
There was a trust between the detainees and the correctional officers, and that trust was basically the treatment that the detainees got from the correctional officers.
Early Monday morning, 3 days after the treaty is signed, prison employee Ted Manier arrives at work. He notices an eerie silence.
There were hardly any inmates in the breakfast area. And normally it would be full of inmates were making a lot of noise and talking, and there was hardly anybody in there, so it was really quiet, unusually quiet.
On the first floor of the Prison Industries building, detainees make mattresses. On the surface, it looks like business as usual. But in an instant, detainees overpower their guards and ignite fires. On the third floor of the Industries building, Manier and his supervisor oversee a furniture-making shop. In a matter of minutes, the riot spreads to the rest of the floors.
It sounded like a roar, and it was coming up the stairwell. They got the door down, and they just came running in. and they had these hoods over their head, like they were made out of gray t-shirts or gray sweatshirts, and they just had holes poked out for their eyes so they could see.
Manier tries to report the emergency, but he is attacked by one of the rioters.
And I don't know if he was trying to hit me or just the telephone out of my hand. He knocked the phone out of my hand that went across the room.
Prison employees are facing their worst nightmare. Although they are well aware of the risks, they never thought it would happen to them.
But we did realize there was a threat, but I guess you think you can control it. When you work with inmates, you get used to them, and sometimes you forget who they really are.
The guards and factory workers are helpless. Unarmed and outnumbered, they face rioters carrying homemade weapons. The staff member notifies Warden Petrovsky of the crisis.
Inside the wall, nobody carried weapons. The inmates always vastly outnumbered the staff. So if we had weapons in there, we could lose those weapons. The only weapons that we had was weapons in the tower.
Petrovsky alerts the FBI and the prison's regional director.
I try to give him an assessment of exactly what transpired and brought him up to date.
As fire spreads throughout the Industries building, the detainees force the guards and employees into a tool cage and lock the door.
We kind of thought that unless there's some miracle, that we would probably just burn up, because there's no way to get out of one of the cages.
The riot spreads throughout the entire penitentiary complex. Enraged detainees capture guards, taking keys as they take hostages. They begin to release the regular prison population from their cells. The riot is beyond containment. The detainees now control most of the central buildings. Rioters attempt to gain access to the main cell block, but guards lock down the sally port just in time. As flames and smoke engulf the massive prison complex, nearly 100 guards and employees are trapped inside. Built at the turn of the century, the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary is the largest penitentiary in the United States.
It was a fortress inside that was surrounded by a wall. It raised from the ground approximately 40 feet, and the width on the top of the wall was approximately 3 yards wide. So it was a massive, massive wall.
Show me what you got. Let's see what we got.
The penitentiary is built on 300 acres of land, with 28 acres of property inside the walls.
Okay, well, we've got guards.
Warden Petrovsky needs to figure out exactly where his people are located inside the complex.
We had staff members in 11 towers that had very good observation over the entire outside compound, who logged those employees that they recognized in those areas. We started a list of the officers that we thought were hostages.
Ted Manier and his colleagues are trapped inside an equipment cage in the burning Industries building. Several rioters try to convince the Cuban detainees guarding the cage to unlock the door.
They were trying to talk the guard into opening the door because they wanted to get us out and kill us or do whatever. So the guard had to tell them that they couldn't open the door, and occasionally they would push one off for getting a little wrestle.
But the raging fire threatens to destroy the building. So the rioters are forced to move their hostages to another part of the prison complex. The only route takes them across the yard in clear view of the towers. A tower guard spots what he believes are detainees threatening prison employees.
There was a guy that was up ahead of me, and he got hit. I remember seeing him. He was a Cuban. He got hit right behind the ear.
One of the hostage takers is killed, and 5 others are wounded.
I was getting worried because the bullets were going pretty close around where we were.
Chaos reigns as guards and detainees run for cover.
They ran us across to the corner of the building where they couldn't shoot at us. And that time they took us in the chapel.
Detainees force their hostages into a small room and lock them inside. Less than an hour after the riots begin, FBI agents from the Atlanta field office arrive at the penitentiary. The FBI has jurisdiction over criminal matters in all federal prisons. Warden Petrovsky briefs Weldon Kennedy, the special agent in charge.
The first thing that I wanted to accomplish was to find out how many hostages had been taken, how many might be injured, what was the threat to those people who were in fact taken hostage. All of these people were like on an emotional high. I mean, they'd been prisoners for literally 8-10 years. Some of them serving life sentences, and now they're free to roam around the prison. It was like a holiday.
This is the area where they...
Agent Leon Blakeney heads the Atlanta FBI SWAT team. Agent Blakeney appears in silhouette to protect his identity.
Nobody really knew what area that the inmates controlled, and they really didn't know how many hostages were taken.
You had 2,500 people housed in that institution.
Here's the administration.
There were people running around all over the place, and quite frankly, it was chaos.
Chaos that had already turned deadly. As agents Kennedy and Blakeney develop their plan to retake the prison, they receive critical intelligence from 2 sources. From FBI agents posted outside the walls of the prison complex, and from prisoners inside the walls who don't want any part of the riot.
We began to learn who the hostages might be, where the detainees were holding up, how many were there, what kind of weapons they might have.
The detainees have taken the guards' radios, compromising prison communications. Agents and guards switch to a secure frequency.
2 white males and 2 black males.
The situation is grim. Negotiations will be critical to resolving the standoff. Special Agent D. Rosario, an FBI negotiator, opens up a dialogue with the rioters.
Unreasonable demands are being made. The hostage takers want things done now. And that's why it is so important to try to bring them down to a level where they can be reasonable. Can you negotiate with people at that very high emotional level? Generally speaking, no. So we had to give it time.
The rioters are emotionally charged, angry over the shooting death of a detainee.
This theme came up time and again. You killed one of ours. You had no reason to, and you killed him. And they wanted me to see the bodies, so I had the body brought out to where we were. I looked at the body. They wanted me to get emotionally involved with them. And these 4 that originally came out to talk to me really were only speaking for themselves. They were not speaking on behalf of the 1,400 that were in there.
In the command post, Warden Petrovsky receives a frantic call from 16 employees who have barricaded themselves in cell block E. E block is home to the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary's most dangerous criminals.
these particular group of inmates were locked away in E to keep them from harming someone.
If the detainees get into cell block E and free the inmates, the lives of all 16 employees will be in danger. The E cell block is also home to the prison system's most notorious inmate, Thomas Silverstein.
A number of people in the Bureau of Prisons told me that he singularly was the toughest prisoner they believed that the Bureau of Prisons had ever housed or had in their custody. He was just an absolute animal, and he hated everything to do with the Bureau of Prisons or any of their staff.
Silverstein was incarcerated in 1975 for a bank robbery. Years later, he was sentenced to multiple life terms for fatally stabbing an inmate and a prison guard.
Thomas Silverstein was cold and he was a killer. He had two things on his mind: to escape from jail because his crimes were such where he was going to die in jail. And the other objective was to kill people. It was as simple as that.
The guards in cell block E are in grave danger. Special Agent Kennedy works with the FBI SWAT team to come up with a plan to rescue them.
The SWAT analysis was that they believed that they could go over the wall out of view of the rioting detainees and retrieve those people out of that building successfully.
The SWAT team will need ladders to get over the 40-foot-high wall. Special Agent Blakeney calls on the Atlanta Fire Department and a National Guard helicopter crew to help carry out the plan.
We put a helicopter up on the opposite side of the prison to attract their attention and at least have some diversion.
Chief, here's the situation. We've got a hostage crisis.
7 hours after the riot began, the FBI SWAT team launches a daring mission to rescue 16 prison employees without endangering the lives of nearly 100 hostages.
I got this. We need to put a truck up on the southwest corner with the ladder up. Everybody got it?
7 hours after a riot breaks out at Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, an FBI SWAT team launches a mission to rescue 16 employees barricaded in one of the prison's cell blocks. FBI Special Agent Weldon Kennedy knows that if the rescue attempt is seen by rioting Cuban detainees, it could spell disaster.
They would not hesitate to kill hostages if it became apparent to them that we were going to try to retake the prison or retake any part of it.
After scaling the wall, the FBI SWAT team approaches cell block E, home to the prison's most dangerous inmates.
Guard, come out, guard! Guard, now!
SWAT rushes the prison employees out of the building.
Keep your head down. Identify yourself when you get down there.
Across the prison yard, 27 employees, afraid for their safety, have barricaded themselves inside the prison hospital. Frustrated, they watch as their colleagues are escorted to safety. FBI SWAT team leader Leon Blakeney.
You know, they're screaming, frantic, you know, come and get us, come and get us.
The director of the Bureau of Prisons urges the FBI SWAT team to go back for the hospital employees.
The SWAT personnel informed me that there was a 100% probability that they would be detected going over the wall to try to effect a rescue of the hospital people.
We can't protect the other hostages that are being held in other parts of the prison. And my concern was if in fact we were observed, then they would start killing the other employees.
Blakeney wants to rescue the hospital staff, but knows it's a risk he cannot afford. The detainees break into cell block E and release the inmates. Vicious criminals run free, including Thomas Silverstein, a ruthless killer. As darkness falls, 3 buildings have been consumed by fire. Nearly 100 guards and employees have been taken hostage or have barricaded themselves inside the prison. Prison employee Ted Manier is being held inside a room in the prison's chapel.
So a man came up to the window, and he wasn't a Cuban. And the guy beside me said, "That's Silverstein." And he came inside, and he had a flashlight, and he started shining his flashlight. He shined the light on me, said, "Don't I know you?" And I told him, "No." I said, "I've never seen you before." And he said, "You don't know who I am?" He looked worse than anything I've ever seen in any type of movie or anything. And when you look at him, you know he isn't a normal. There's something strange about him. He's really scary.
Detainees finally distract Silverstein and he leaves without harming the hostages. On day 2 of the standoff, FBI Tactical Commander Danny Colson arrives at the prison.
You could hear this huge roar. It was like a million bumblebees. You could almost feel the energy of those rioting prisoners.
Colson started the FBI's hostage rescue team, an elite counterterrorism group in 1982. The HRT is law enforcement's equivalent to the Navy SEALs or the Army's Delta Force.
The only unit in the United States that has a sophisticated explosive or thermal breaching capability is the FBI's hostage rescue team.
But the HRT is already tied up, handling the riot at Oakdale.
So I was going to a very difficult tactical assignment without the team I was used to commanding.
Despite not having the hostage rescue team available to him, Colson must still develop a full-scale tactical rescue plan. He faces several obstacles.
A prison is built to keep bad guys in. You have barred doors, you have steel gates. Well, these same type of things keep a rescue force from getting in. I needed help from the military, primarily from the Delta Force.
Delta Force is the Army's Special Operations Unit, but using them at the prison would be illegal.
The Posse Comitatus law was passed right after the Civil War, and that law prevents the military from being involved actively with their personnel in civil law enforcement.
Barring approval from the White House, the FBI must rely solely on civilian law enforcement. Weldon Kennedy assembles over 400 SWAT members at the prison.
We had SWAT teams from all around the country, Chicago, New York, as well as, of course, the immediate surrounding area.
We figured that based on the capability we had, we were probably maybe an hour away from getting in to rescue the hostages. We were all concerned that they started killing hostages. We were helpless to get in there. And that's one of the reasons that De Rosario and the other negotiators were working so hard to try to get somebody to talk to calm the situation down.
But the negotiations are not going well. None of the rioters De Rosario has spoken with has enough power to influence the detainees. The negotiators need a different approach.
We could be here for a very long time unless we come up with a group of people in there among the detainees that can speak basically for, if not all of them, for the majority.
Rosario asks prison employees which detainees command the most respect.
Files of these people were opened to us, and we looked at several of them, and we decided on 5 or 6 men. We went to the grading and called them by name, and they came to the grading, and we invited them to come over to our side and sit down at a table with us and talk with us.
The detainees agree to talk with negotiators.
And we began our first serious conversations in terms of how can we resolve this? What is it that you're looking for? The number one demand that they had was that ultimately the Immigration and Naturalization Service conduct individual hearings for each and every one of them to remain in the United States.
It's a straightforward request. Rosario agrees to pass it on to the Department of Justice. As the meeting ends, the negotiator uses a bit of psychology to help solidify the group's standing as leaders within the prison.
We decided to give these men the mail that had accumulated since before the riot began.
In the penitentiary, daily mail is an important link to the outside world.
They went back in there, and we could literally hear the shouting of glee when these guys showed up with 2 bags full of mail. We believe it created in the minds of the others that these guys could get things done for them. And that's where it began. After that, we kept asking for the same men.
Rosario is beginning to make progress, but negotiations go slowly. In the prison hospital, 27 trapped employees are out of time. Detainees are trying to break down the door of the hospital with a battering ram. The employees call Warden Petrovsky in the command center. Warden Petrovsky relays the information to Weldon Kennedy. Detainees could break through the hospital doors at any moment.
We had 27 people in there, and there was concern that once the hospital was taken over, they might be injured or even killed. So the ram is going, we can hear it as a matter of fact, banging the metal doors of the prison.
Bureau of Prison officials worry about what could happen if detainees get access to the drugs and narcotics stored in the hospital.
What about right here?
Weldon Kennedy asks HRT Commander Danny Colson for a second assessment.
I said, yeah, we can get them out. We can go over the wall. We can defend the area with the perimeter and slide them out over the walls, and we're out of there.
Colson's biggest concern is that the detainees are watching news coverage of the riots.
Inmates were watching TV to see what we were doing as much as they could. And they could very well believe that a rescue of the entire prison was underway, and then they could start executing the hostages.
Hospital workers are moments away from becoming hostages, or worse.
So here we have a huge dilemma. Do we go in and take those people out of the hospital and save them, or do we let them be taken hostage?
Kennedy decides a rescue is too risky.
My decision was based on all the information that I had. We will not go for the rescue. I will not authorize the rescue.
And when he went back in and announced it to the Bureau of Prisons, I remember one Bureau of Prisons official storming past me and looking at me and said, if those are FBI agents, you'd go get them. And I said, no, he wouldn't.
Weldon Kennedy wonders if he has just signed a death warrant for 27 innocent people. For 2 days, a riot rages at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Dozens of Cuban detainees now control the prison. 27 Bureau of Prison employees are trapped in the prison hospital. Weldon Kennedy, special agent in charge of the FBI's Atlanta field office, makes a tough decision.
If we entered the penitentiary, if we tried to retake it, there was a threat they were going to immediately kill them all.
Kennedy decides not to launch a rescue mission. 2 hours after the decision, communication is lost with the employees in the prison hospital.
It's the warden. Pick up if you hear me.
I knew that if anything happened to any one of those 27 people, that I would forever live with that as being the person responsible.
Guards stationed at the prison towers gather intelligence as detainees move hostages across the prison yard. One guard calls the FBI command post with a disturbing development. A group of detainees is dragging acetylene tanks into a basement where they can access the prison's utility tunnels. Danny Colson is the FBI's tactical commander at the scene.
They might be able to bring those tanks and get enough of them underneath our command post where the tunnels ran and cause an explosion, which would have decimated the command post and maybe have allowed them to escape.
Colson and the FBI SWAT team prepare to go down into the tunnels.
The tunnels were designed for two purposes. One is all the utilities went through the tunnels, the steam pipes, the electrical pipes, and they were big tunnels. There were also ventilation tunnels that started big enough for a man to walk in standing up and ended up only a few inches high.
Colson and SWAT team leader Leon Blakeney have no idea what they will encounter once they are inside. Prison maps aren't reliable, and communication with agents above ground is not possible. As the team makes their way through the underground maze of pipes, they encounter a group of detainees. Leon Blakeney.
Once we got in the tunnels, we discovered then that in fact the Cubans were in there.
And oftentimes we'd come in very close proximity to them, within 10 feet of them. There would be a bunch of them and we'd confront them, and fortunately every time they'd turn around and run.
The SWAT team is unable to find the acetylene tanks in the vast underground system, but they are convinced the detainees are exploring the tunnels for a possible escape route.
We decided that the tunnel system was a real threat to the successful resolution of the crisis.
Ultimately, we were able to station SWAT teams down there. The Chicago SWAT team handled one part of the tunnel system, and the Washington Field Office SWAT team handled another part of the tunnel system.
On day 3 of the standoff, Danny Colson receives intelligence from agents with high-powered binoculars positioned around the prison. The detainees have moved nearly all the hostages to a building known as the American Dorm. Colson begins to formulate a tactical rescue plan.
What do you think I mean, what can it...
Outside the prison, crowds gather. Families of the hostages, the prison guards, and even the detainees wait for information about their loved ones. The media covers breaking news from the penitentiary.
There was hundreds of media people there. There were networks, there was local TV. They established a tent city right across the street from the prison.
A single reporter and a simple error threatened to bring the standoff to a violent end. Special Agent D. Rosario.
The New York SWAT team was coming off shift, and the Chicago SWAT team was coming on shift, and they passed each other right at the steps of the administration building. And it looked impressive because there was two very large groups of armed men, all dressed in black.
Local reporter in Atlanta is watching this and sees these 40 or 50 men dressed in SWAT gear going up the front steps, and jumps to the conclusion and says so on live TV that, well, there they go. Looks like the FBI is going to retake control of the prison.
When the detainees see the media report, they take immediate action.
They brought several hostages out to the yard. And for the benefit of our cameras, so we could see them, they brought these hostages out and they poured gasoline over them. And then they took their cigarette lighters and began clicking whilst literally screaming at us, "If you want to assault us, go ahead. As soon as you do, we're setting fire to these men."
Without knowing it, a young journalist may have just made a mistake that could cost the lives of nearly 100 innocent people. At the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, FBI agents negotiate with Cuban detainees who have taken over the prison. The lives of nearly 100 hostages hang in the balance. On day 3 of the standoff, a journalist's error ignites a crisis. FBI Tactical Commander Danny Colson.
All along, our negotiators have been telling the Cubans that we weren't coming in, that we wanted to negotiate and wanted them to surrender. And now a reporter is saying we're coming in.
The erroneous media report makes Special Agent D. Rosario's job even tougher as he negotiates for the lives of the hostages.
We had brought them down to such a reasonable level of emotion, and when they thought that the FBI was about to assault, they literally lost it.
We came literally within a few heartbeats of losing the hostages right then and there.
We sent everybody to what we call phase line green, which is the last position you are in before you do a rescue. It was like a spark that was about to ignite this terrible inferno of energy we had built up there.
I had to convince them that no such assault was going to take place, and that, you know, if things were going so well and so positive, why would we even think about assaulting them?
After 3 tense hours, the rioters agree to continue negotiations and spare the hostages.
We're just lucky that our negotiators were able to calm them down and we didn't have any loss of life.
For Colson, the close call is a warning sign that the standoff could explode into a full-scale riot with very little provocation. At the end of day 3, he obtains presidential approval to deploy Delta Force in a civilian crisis. The Special Operations Team arrives in Atlanta disguised as FBI agents.
There were 3 things that I desperately needed from them. The first was their breaching capability. They had all the breaching capability that would be necessary to get back into that prison to do a dynamic rescue. They had the ability to use explosives to blow steel doors down or blow locks out. They had the ability to use thermal devices to cut in an instant through steel and cable. The second thing I wanted was their sniper capability. When we went into that prison, if we had to go in, I wanted the very best snipers I could find doing cover for my men as they went in. The other thing is they have tremendous medical capability.
They travel with a complete hospital. They set up with the doctors, nurses, emergency equipment, the latest state-of-the-art everything.
If Delta Force or FBI teams engage the detainees in combat, the military hospital is prepared to treat any injury.
They can bring their doctors right in with us. They can pop a chest and do open heart surgery right there in the premises if necessary.
For the next several days, Delta Force snipers keep the detainees under constant surveillance. The rioters are working 24 hours a day, making weapons by the thousands.
There's all kinds of steel inside the prison, and they were very resourceful with the equipment. They ground weapons into spears. Each one of them must have had at least 2 weapons.
Delta Force sets up surveillance cameras all over the complex to track the movement of the detainees. Agents look for ways to get closer to the areas where the hostages are being held. If the Cuban detainees decide to kill the hostages, the tactical team must be able to launch an assault on a moment's notice.
We've got 2 people guarding the American dorm.
This is not something where you play a video game and after it's over, you hit your reset button and everybody's alive again. You're talking about the lives of human beings here, and you have a tremendous responsibility to try to get those people out.
Colson and Blakeney go back into the tunnels underneath the prison. One of the tunnels leads to the prison's electrical room. It's located right outside the American dorm, where most of the hostages are held.
We were literally on the other side of the window from inmates that were right across the walkway from where the hostages were being held. By doing that, we moved our response time from half an hour to 10 seconds. It was a tremendous leap in our capability at that point.
With the FBI SWAT teams and Delta Force in place, they will be in a better position to protect the hostages if negotiations break down.
Until they start harming a hostage, there's no reason for us to try to gain forcible entry to save these people. We therefore will wait as long as it takes.
The rioters have enough food to survive for up to a year. The day after Thanksgiving, they erect a Christmas tree on the roof of the building.
That was very disheartening to us. Maybe they didn't intend it psychologically to be that way. We interpret it as we are going to be here through Christmas.
On day 8 of the crisis, prison guards stationed in the tunnel hear the sound of a drill. One guard recognizes the voice of Thomas Silverstein, the most vicious inmate in the federal prison system. They think Silverstein is searching for a way out.
We knew he would absolutely kill a hostage if it would help him escape.
Weldon Kennedy asks Danny Colson to go back into the tunnels to apprehend Silverstein.
So we walked down the tunnel and we did a tactical formation going down the tunnel. We had lights on our weapons. Suddenly we noticed there was water on the floor, and then the water started getting deeper, and it was over the tops of our shoes, and then over our ankles and up to our knees. Then what we finally realized is that that tunnel was actually flooded.
The water flooding the tunnels had been dumped by National Guard helicopters to fight the fires. Looking further into the tunnel, he can see water fills it to the ceiling. He knows there is no way Thomas Silverstein can be in there.
And what they were hearing was there were tubes, ventilation tubes, that were above the water line. So the guards were actually hearing his voice, but we knew he wasn't going to get out.
Still, Colson knows that Silverstein is as dangerous inside the prison as he is on the outside.
He was a sociopath, and he'd proven he would commit murder. So had he done that, had he attempted to harm a guard or anybody else in there, it would have caused us to have to go in and launch a rescue we didn't want to have to launch. And again, we were faced with significant loss of life.
Knowing Thomas Silverstein is such a dangerous wild card, FBI negotiator D. Rosario must convince the detainees to turn him over.
United States, okay?
I emphasized and kept re-emphasizing the fact that Tommy Silverstein could become a very grave liability to the Cuban detainees and to their cause and to what they were trying to attain. I was told that they would think about it.
Rosario tells the rioters that until Silverstein is back behind bars, the hostages are in grave danger. As long as the vicious killer roams free, the standoff could come to a sudden and violent end. More than a week into the intense standoff with Cuban detainees at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, FBI negotiators worry that a dangerous American prisoner could jeopardize a peaceful end to the conflict.
What I suggested to them was that at some point or another, it would be in your best interest to turn Tommy Silverstein over to us.
Special Agent D. Rosario tries to convince the rioters that Silverstein is a serious threat to prison employees who are being held hostage. The American inmate is jeopardizing their position in the negotiations. A short time later, a large group of detainees appears at the Sallyport gate of the main cell block.
And there was about 100 Cubans screaming, waving their sabers in the air. And I could see they had Silverstein. And in the midst of all these screaming Cubans, they literally threw Silverstein at us.
Detainees tell agents how they captured Silverstein.
So they gained access to the pharmacy. They took some narcotic. They put it in a can of fruit cocktail, which he was known to like, and fed him fruit cocktail laced liberally with this drug, which in effect knocked him out.
The FBI viewed Silverstein's capture as an act of good faith.
That told us a lot. They don't want to hurt the hostages.
It showed the negotiators that these Cubans were responsible. They were willing to do things to cooperate with us in order to reach a common goal, which is a great step in any negotiation process.
On December 1st, a separate riot at Louisiana's Oakdale Penitentiary is resolved. The Cuban detainees incarcerated at Oakdale agree to release their hostages if the INS will review their cases.
The government of the United States, through the voice of the Attorney General, told them, you know, it's not unreasonable to give you a hearing.
D. Rosario offers the Atlanta detainees the same deal. The hostage takers have gotten exactly what they want, but still, negotiations stall. Audio surveillance reveals the rioters think the FBI will not use deadly force to remove them from the prison, that they would have a fighting chance to overpower federal forces.
The Cubans thought that the FBI and the other assets would come in with nightsticks and batons and just duke it out.
The next day, Colson decides to send the hostage takers an indelible message. The detainee agrees to talk with Colson.
And he said, I need to go to the restroom. So I said, wait right here. So I went around the barrier and I got the Marshall's SOG team and the New York City SWAT team. I got them all up and I said, put on all your gear and line up along the walls and look mean. And he walked around that barricade, and when he walked down that corridor, he literally jumped off the ground. And I said, this is not going to be a nightstick duel with your swords. We're going to use deadly force.
The rioters agree to the terms of the surrender. On day 12 of the standoff, the Cuban detainees release their hostages.
I will never, ever forget those guys coming through that sally point and walking right by me, and the look of relief. They were haggard and they were tired and they were worn out, but this great sense of relief, and they were all smiling ear to ear.
When we finally walked out with hostages, not one of them having been harmed in any way, we regarded that as a huge success.
After 12 intense days, the Atlanta prison riot is over.
One of the most important things, it sort of focused the American public on the plight of the Cubans. And I think that was important. They did have a story to tell. They just told it in the wrong way.
After the riots, all detainees are granted an INS hearing. Some are released. Others with criminal records or mental disabilities are repatriated back to Cuba. The rest remain in prison.